Okay, so now we're going to look at a different branch of machine learning which solves problems where we don't want to try to predict some target value, but rather we want to transform the data to find patterns in the data and transform it into something more useful. So I'm going to talk a bit about what is this unsupervised learning, and we're going to look at two examples or two applications of unsupervised learning. One for dimensionality reduction. I'm going to talk about manifold learning and also mention principal component analysis briefly. And then we're going to look at clustering, which is grouping together similar examples. And we're going to use k-means as an example of a clustering algorithm, but you have lots of different clustering algorithms in Scikit-Learn. So the basic idea of unsupervised learning is that we don't have target labels for use during training. So we are not using some error measure to try to supervise the performance of our system, of our learner. But we want our learner to do some transformation of our data in order to give us new feature values, not a prediction, but new features that are more useful. So this can be used for data visualization and data understanding. It can be used for things like estimating distribution parameters. For example, we used kernel density estimation a few weeks ago, and this is one of the things we can do with unsupervised learning. That's an example. We can do things like extracting new features, selecting features, and so on. And what we're going to look at in this lecture will be dimensionality reduction, which is very useful for visualization, and especially with manifold learning, and also clustering, which is useful when you have data that you want to organize into similar examples. So let's see first the idea of manifold learning. So mathematically, a manifold is a set of points for which the neighborhood is homeomorphic to a Euclidean space. That is, around the neighborhood of each point, that neighborhood works like a Euclidean surface. For example, the surface of a sphere can be a manifold that is embedded in these three dimensions, but it's a lower dimensional space that locally approximates an Euclidean space. So that's why we can create maps of the surface of the Earth. Of course, if you go away from a large distance from one point, then the distances will start getting distorted and you start deviating from the Euclidean space. But close to each point, you have an approximation to this Euclidean space. And the idea of manifold learning is try to learn this embedding, this subspace of our data, where we can represent the data with lower number of dimensions without losing the topology, the spatial relations between the points. For example, suppose we have these points, this data set. It's a three-dimensional data set. We have a set of points in 3 dimensions, but we can see that the points follow this curved line. So in theory, we could represent the position of the points by just using one coordinate following this line here, and we could still preserve the structure of this data set in 1 dimension. We wouldn't need the 3 features, the 3 dimensions to represent it. So if we could project it into something like this or like this, where we can, for example, in 2 dimensions, we reduced one of the dimensions, but we still have some preservation of the topology of the distances between the points. Or even if we sort it out in 1 dimension, I just represented here the points spread out. So we see, for example, there is a superposition here, but we can reduce this fairly well to 1 dimension and still preserve most of the structure in our data. So this can be useful. In this case, it's not particularly useful because we start with few dimensions and we can visualize the data. But if you have 4, 5, 6, 7 dimensions, then you cannot visualize everything. And when you're dealing with a large number of dimensions, then you can have problems with overfitting and problems with fitting your models that may work better if you reduce the number of dimensions. So one very used algorithm for this TSNE is this distributed stochastic t-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, and the idea is that we have this probability of selecting, for given one point, of selecting another point as a neighbor, and this is modeled as a probability with a Gaussian distribution. So the further apart the points are, the less probable they are of being considered neighbors. And now we have a lower dimensional space where we can represent our data, and we are going to keep the same distribution here. So in the lower dimensional space, we must have the same probability of picking one point as the neighbor of another. So this could be a Gaussian distribution too, but for performance, and it improves the performance and lowers the computational cost if you use a t-student distribution in the lower dimension. So this is why this is the TSNE. But the idea is the same. We want the distribution of probabilities of being neighbor of point I, for example, or in this case the probability of point J being neighbor of I, but we're going to do this for all the points. We want this distribution to be the same in the lower dimensional projection as it is in the original space. So after we get this, we then compute these the values, the positions of the points in the lower dimensional projection that minimize the divergence between these two probability distributions. So basically, we want this probability distribution to be as close as possible to that one, even though we are projecting our data into lower dimensions. So this we get in this case. So if we start with our three-dimensional data set, if we project this into 2 dimensions, this is one of the things we can get. Note that TSNE is stochastic, so you don't get always exactly the same result. You get variations, but this is an example of what you can get here. And you see that when we projected this into 2 dimensions, we are preserving not only the points that are close together, but also keeping apart those that are further apart. And this is much better than just squeezing this into 2 dimensions, because then we would have lots of overlapping points, which in the original space are distant. And also we can do this into 1 dimension, so this is what we get here. There are some fragments, some points that should be neighbors but are spread out, because TSNE cannot solve all of these constraints at the same time, but still most of the points keep their neighbors together, and we can find here the progression we have along this line. Another example is IMap, and this works similarly. The idea is similar, to try to keep the neighbors together, but this algorithm creates a list of k nearest neighbors, so those that are nearest to each point, and computes the graph connecting each point to its closest neighbors. And now it's going to compute pairwise distances from the path on those graphs, and then embeds those distances by solving the problem of projecting into a lower dimensional space where these distances are respected as much as possible. So the general idea is similar. It's going to try to preserve the neighborhoods of the points, but in this case ISOMAP is deterministic, so you always get the same output, and it tries to do basically the same general idea of trying to find this manifold, this lower dimensional projection that respects the topology of our data. So let's see an example with this data set, the IRIS data set. This is a generic, a very well-known example in machine learning, because it's often used to illustrate many problems. And we have these flowers, for which each individual flower was measured by these 4 measures. So the length and width of the sepals, and the length and width of the petals. And we have three classes of flowers, so three different species or genera of flowers: Setosa, versicolor, and Virginica. And this is the data file that we have. We have all these columns with the length and width of the sepals and petals, and then we have the name of the class in the last column. And these are the three types of flower that we have in the data set. So the problem here is that since we have 4 features, we cannot visualize our data. We cannot do a 4-dimensional diagram that shows us how the data is distributed. So let's reduce the dimensionality here, and we're going to use 2 different techniques. So I'm going to use principal component analysis. Probably you know what this is, but the basic idea is that we are going to project our data into those vectors, into a new coordinate system determined by the vectors where we have most of the variance in our data. So the principal component, the first component, will be the direction along which most of the variance can be found. The second one will be perpendicular to the first, and the direction in which most of the remaining variant can be found. So one way we can do this, we are going to import pandas to read the data file. So we read the CSV like this. We're going to plot, so import matplotlib, and we're going to import PCA from the Scikit-Learn decomposition module to do principal component analysis. Now, another thing that I just use this example to illustrate, it's not really important in this case because we have everything in millimeters, and also the kind of transformation we're doing already rescales the data, for example, for PCA and things like that. But in this particular case, probably it makes no difference, but you should often, in general, rescale your data so that different features do not have wildly different ranges of values. We saw how to do this manually by subtracting the mean and dividing by the standard deviation, but you can use this scale function in the pre-processing module that does precisely that. You can customize this and tell it what exactly to do, but if you do it like this, it does standardization. It subtracts the mean and divides by the standard deviation of your features. It expects you to have each example in a row and each feature in a column, but as long as you have that, this works, and you can use this instead of doing rescaling manually. So we're going to read our data, and then since we have the features in the first 4 columns, I'm going to take just the matrix of values from the data frame and use all the rows and the first 4 columns. So this is just the numeric data. I don't care about the data frame itself, except just for reading CSV as a convenience. So now I'm going to create this PCA object, and I'm going to tell it how many components I want to retain. So I want to draw this, I want to plot this in 2 dimensions, so I'm going to retain 2 components, and I'm going to transform my features matrix, which has 4 columns, into the 2 columns of the embedding I'm computing here. So to do that, I'm going to use this object and using fit transform. So fit computes the parameters. In this case, it would be the principal components, the directions in which we're going to project, and transform would transform the data after fitting into the embedding I want. But in this case, I don't need to retain the PCA object. I just want the results, so I can do fit transform in one go, and I get the embedded values here. So now I can plot this, and this is simply I'm plotting the data I have in the 2-dimensional space in this embedding by looping through all the different labels I have in my data frame. So I'm using the unique there on the name column, and this gives me the 3 unique values here, which are the names of the 3 different types of flowers. And now for each name, I'm going to create a mask for all the rows in the column that are that have that specific name, and I'm going to plot only those rows of the embedded matrix that correspond to those that class of flower. And I'm going also to add this so I can put in a legend in the end. Okay, so this is the result I have. I can reduce from 4 dimensions into 2 with principal component analysis by looking at the vectors, at the directions where I have most of the variance. So this would be the direction with most variance in my data set, and this would be the perpendicular direction, or the direction with most variance that is perpendicular to the first. That would be the second component. So this is doing this with PCA. I can also easily do it with TSNE. So I imported here TSNE. I just need to replace this here. And so if I did this, I could easily do TSNE instead of PCA. And this is what I show here. So I'm going to also create one object for TSNE with 2 components. Then I do the fit transform of my original 4-dimensional data set. I get a 2-dimensional embedding here, and this would be the result. So note that with PCA, we are not doing manifold learning. We are not worried about trying to keep the topology of the data in these lower dimensions. We are just projecting along the directions where we have most variance. So we get, in this case, we get this kind of result, a very large cloud here with a very large overlap between the green and the red, and not much distance between red and blue, because this is just looking at the overall variance of our data. In this case, we are looking at trying to preserve the distances, the neighbors, close neighbors of our points. So we get a bit better separation here between the two, and we get also this effect. So it seems that setosa is significantly different from from versicolor and virginica. But basically, you have different ways of doing this dimensionality reduction. If you use those manifold learning methods, you can get a better correspondence to the actual topology of your data. With PCA, you do dimensionality reduction by looking at the variance. I used PCA here as a comparison because PCA is probably still the most widely used method, but this is just mostly out of tradition, and because, well, everyone uses PCA for a long time, so everyone keeps using PCA. But for different problems, it may be better to look at alternatives. And if you use Python with Scikit-Learn, it's very easy to use these alternatives. So now moving on to another important part of supervised learning, which is clustering. The idea here is that we want to group similar examples together. For example, suppose we have a data set that is spread out like this. To our eyes, it's probably evident that we have one group here, and one group here. So we should be able to do something like this, create these groups which have different groups of examples. They are more similar inside the group than to examples outside the group. But we want to do this automatically, not by looking at the examples. And also note that I'm going to show this in 2 dimensions, but in general you can have more than 2 dimensions, and so visualization there becomes a lot trickier. So the idea is that we want to group similar examples together, and for that we need to have some measure of similarity or difference or distance between the examples, so that we can minimize the differences or the distances inside the clusters, or maximize the similarity, and maximize the difference or the distances between the clusters. Note that distance, it has some specific properties. You have the triangular inequality. It's never less than 0. It's only 0 if the 2 points are identical, and so on. Differences or similarities are a more generic term. They may not meet those criteria or not respect those constraints. But you need to have something like this. You need to have some measure of how alike points are or how distant or different they are in order to cluster them together. And the purpose of clustering is to help us understand data and relations. Suppose that you have 100,000 examples of some data set. If you can figure out that they are grouped into 5 different groups, this can help you a lot to understand what data you have, instead of having to look at each individual data point with 100,000 examples or something like that. So finding meaningful groups is an important part of our understanding of things, and clustering also helps us process the data, transform the data, and so on. So basically, we want to use clustering to try to find what is relevant in our data. I'm going to use this k-means clustering as an example, but you have lots of different types of clustering in Scikit-Learn, so I recommend that you take a look at the examples there. But this is a very simple concept for clustering, and also has this simple Lloyd's algorithm for computing k-means, so it helps illustrate the approach. So the idea is that we predefine the number of clusters that we want to find. With k-means, we specify the number of clusters beforehand. There are other clusterings that don't require you to specify the number of clusters. And then we obtain a partition that is exclusive. That is, each example is assigned to only one cluster, and it's complete. All the examples are assigned to a cluster. It's also based on prototypes. You have one centroid which represents the cluster. So you can actually get some new examples that represent each family, each cluster of examples. And the algorithm is basically to start with a random distribution of centroids. Then we are going to cluster our examples by assigning each example to its closest representative. And then we are going to update the centroids to place them in the mean of each cluster and recompute. So I'm going to show this, illustrate this. One way of initializing the algorithm is this forgy method, which is we start with a subset of the examples at random as the centroids for the starting clusters. For example, suppose that we selected these at random, and these are our starting clusters, our starting centroids. Now, what we're going to do is, since we have these centroids here, we can assign each point in our data set to the closest representative, so to the closest centroid. So these will be the circles, these would be the triangles here, these would be the squares, the hexagons there, and the other triangles on this side. And now we're going to update the position of our centroids, of those points representing the clusters, in order that each one is at the mean point of the points in its group. So we're going to recompute the position of the centroids, and now we're going to shift the centroids and recompute the clusters. So when we change their position, for example, we change the triangle here, now we're going to recompute the clusters, we change again, and some points start changing because the centroids are moving, and as the points change their belonging to one cluster and they start belonging to the other, the centroids move again, and we keep doing this until we reach convergence. So at some point there is no one is changing from one cluster to the other, so the centroids don't change position, and now we reached conversion and we have the result. So this way we can create these representatives for each cluster and assign each point to the closest representative. So one possible use of this is if you know how many clusters you should have in one particular distribution and you want to find out where these clusters are. So this is a very obvious application of clustering. Of course, you can do this by other criteria, for example, density, affinity, and so on, and you have different clustering methods available in Scikit-Learn. But I'm going to use now the example I'm going to choose is deliberately outside this more obvious application. because I wanted to give you also an idea that you don't need to use this only for the more obvious applications, and sometimes you can use this for different purposes. In fact, one of the original purposes of k-means was for quantization. Quantization is the process of converting continuous values into a set of discrete ranges or discrete categories for those values. This is something that you can use for signal compression, for lowering the amount of data, of information you need to represent something. And we're going to use this, we're going to use k-means to do vector quantization on the color values of an image. So I'm going to, I chose this image from an example in Wikipedia because this particular image has no blue color. So all these images have the three channels, red, green, and blue. But in this particular one, the blue channel is always at 0. It only has red and green mixed together for the different colors. So we can read the image and plot the distribution of the pixels into dimensions. So this is the red channel, this is the green channel. Here you have things that are dark green because they have no red and only green. Here you have the yellows because you have a mixture of green and red. Here you have some orange and some pale green and so forth. So how can we do this? We can use Scikit-Image. If you want to work with images, Scikit-Image is very useful because it gives you the functions to read and write images from using different formats. So I can use IMread from Scikit-Image to read this image, this PNG file, and this will give me a matrix, a NumPy array with the color values. So basically this is a three-dimensional matrix that has width and height the same shape as the image we have, but also has 3 layers for the 3 colors, red, green, and blue. Now we're going to reshape this into one matrix with 3 columns, red, green, and blue, and 1 line for each pixel. So again, we can use reshape here. We're going to divide everything by 255 because the pixel values are in bytes. They are between 0 and 255. We're going to convert this into floating point numbers between 0 and 1. And we're going to reshape this so that the matrix has as many rows as the total number of pixels, which is the width and the height of the image, and 3 columns, which correspond to the 3 colors, red, green, and blue. And now what we want for our image, to use k-means and quantize the color, is only the first 2 channels, red and green. We don't want the blue one because the blue one is always at 0 and we can discard it. So this we can do here. We can throw away the last channel. If you are using other more realistic images, you generally would not do this, and you would use the complete image, of course, but that makes it harder to picture what we're doing. So I chose this picture so we can do all the plots in 2 dimensions. And now we can plot this. So basically I have I create the figure, the 2 axes, red and green. I plot all the coordinates of the colors of all the pixels. So the first coordinate is red, the second coordinate is green. And here I'm using a different, something that we did not see yet, which is to color each point with a different color. So instead of using plot, I'm using scatter from pyplot. And in the color, I can give an array with the same number of values as I have for points, and each of these will be a color. So this can have different formats, but one possible format is a list or a tuple of 3 values indicating red, green, and blue. And I can do that by simply taking the original table of all the pixel colors, converting it into a list, because this does not work well with a NumPy array, and this basically is the list of all the colors of all the pixels. And here I can set the size of the circle. So this is what gives me this image. I'm plotting the coordinates for all the pixels using the colors as coordinate values, but I'm also painting all the pixels in their corresponding colors. So these are all the pixels of this image, but plotted as a function of, with green as a function of red. And now we're going to do k-means. So this is the result of using k-means with 64 centroids. I can do it like this. I imported k-means here from Scikit-Learn cluster, and I create a new object which uses as the number of clusters this number of colors that I chose. So I'm creating a k-means object with 64 clusters, and I'm going to train the model, or to fit the model, using the array of values I have created here. So this image array is a matrix with 1 pixel per row and 2 colors with red and green. So this is what I am representing here, and these are the positions of the centroids, which I can do by plotting all the centroids of the clustering after the fitting is done. So after I run fit, the k-means object will have computed the positions of all the centroids, and now I can get those positions from these cluster centers, and I plot them here on the graph. By the way, I'm plotting them twice, because I'm plotting once in black and once in white, so I get this effect here. Okay, so I draw a large black cross and then a smaller white cross, and I get this effect here. This is just one of the many things you can do with plotting. And I can also now convert the individual colors into the cluster. So instead of having all these different colors, I group them together and give the same color to all the pixels that are neighbors of one of these centroids. Now this, you cannot see this very well here. Maybe if I increase magnification, okay, maybe like this, we can see a bit these frontiers here, but with 64 colors the difference is not much. But we can use the centroids, and assign the colors to the pixels. We can do it like this. We create a new matrix for our colors with the same shape as the original one. And now for each row in this matrix, that is for each pixel, we're going to see what centroid the pixel corresponds to. And the pixel, we can get the centroids where the pixel corresponds to from the labels of the cluster. We give the array, we predict which cluster each pixel belongs to, and now we can use that labels array to find the appropriate centroid, and the centroid gives us the red and green components of the color that is the representative color for that cluster. That is the mean color of all the pixels in that cluster. So now I set those values on the red and green channel, and I save the image to a file. So this IMsave saves the matrix I have here into the image file. Now this matrix has all the pixels in different rows, so it has 3 columns with all the pixels. I need to reshape it to have the original shape of the original image, but that's easy to do. I just reshape it back, and this is the result. So this is the original image with all those different colors, and now this is the image reduced to only 64 different colors. There are only 64 different combinations of red, green, blue in this image here. And you can do this reduction. It's a considerable reduction, but by looking at the image, it's difficult to tell that we actually reduced the colors. We can do this, we can go a bit more, do a larger reduction by using only 8 centroids. So this would be the k-means with k equals 8, the distribution of the clusters. Now we do this quantization. We convert the color of each pixel to the color of its corresponding cluster. So the color corresponding to where the centroid is at. And now we reduce the image. And now you can see that when we reduce this image to only 8 colors, we now start to see some effects there. But this is one possible application of clustering. And the idea here is not only to show you a bit how you can process images. We don't have time to go into that into more detail, but you have this Scikit image library that allows you to read images into matrix, a NumPy array, and then it allows you to write again. So you can manipulate the images, change things in the images. And also I wanted to show you that clustering is not merely that obvious application of putting grouping things together by their similarity, so by looking at what kinds of groups you have in your data set, but you can actually use clustering for different applications. So in this case, we could reduce the number of different values we have for the colors and still retain approximately the same kind of image we have. So you could use this if you have, for example, many different combinations of some values, but you want to reduce that to a more manageable set of categories, and using the mean value of each category as a representative. And you can use k-means. You can specify with the number of clusters how many categories you want, and you can do that this way. Okay, so this was a bit speeded up because the whole part of machine learning is actually quite a lot. It's a very large subject, but it's also something that is both very powerful and very easy to use if you know what you're doing. So if these kind of techniques are useful for your work, you should look into the details of the different algorithms, where to use them, what kind of details you need to pay attention to so you don't use them incorrectly. But then if you have them in Scikit-Learn, it's very easy to apply them to your problems. And also, if you are working with images, then Scikit-Image also makes it easy to do image manipulation, processing, and so on. Okay, so the important part in this second lecture, Unsupervised Learning, I covered two different things. One is reducing the number of dimensions that you have. You have many features, but you want to transform your data into a smaller number of features, which may be for visualization, for preventing overfitting, because note that what we saw in the previous lecture is that if we expand our features too much, we start getting overfitting. But if you already start with too many features, then you are already at overfitting even without doing any expansion. So you would need to select the best features or to transform your features into a smaller, lower dimensional space in order to reduce those effects. So dimensionality reduction can be done as a sort of pre-processing to supervised learning, but it can also be used for visualization, for helping understanding, for improving clustering, because if you're trying to do clustering with too many dimensions, you also have problems. So there are lots of applications here. And for this, for dimensionality reduction, I just wanted to point out that you have these more traditional techniques like principal component analysis, which don't care too much about the topology of your data, just trying to preserve, for example, the most variance possible when projecting into a lower dimension. On the other hand, you have these more recent techniques of manifold learning, where you try to keep the same kind of relations between points, the same patterns of distances, which points are close together, which are further apart. And here you have lots of different options, and you can check them out here in Scikit-Learn on the page on manifold learning. You have many different examples and illustrations on about what kind of algorithms work best for different types of problems. Clustering is something that is useful in general when you want to group data by similarity, and this is an important step for understanding your data. Quite often, if you have too much data, it's much easier to understand if you look at groups of similar examples. But you can also use clustering for other kinds of applications, like we saw in quantization, for example, where you specify the number of clusters and you set that as a set of classes, of categories, where you're going to reduce the values of your data to. So from here onwards, I'm going to try to update the lecture notes. Unfortunately, this semester was very busy for me, and I had to restructure this course for online lectures and for having extra credit. So it went from 2 to 3 ECTS credits, and so I did not have time to keep the lecture notes up to date. But I'm going to try to do that maybe in the next couple of weeks. For this week, the tutorial should be dedicated to your final project, to start looking at the details and questions that you may have about what to do. And I propose the deadline for submitting everything to be July 19. So note that you need to submit the exercises every week. You have the final exercise on the web page now, but you don't. This submission every week is just so that you keep up with the subject matter. If you want to improve the way you solved the exercises, especially the first ones, because at that time you probably did not have much practice with Python, then you can also send everything together with your final project by July the 19th. And for grading, I will evaluate only the last version. If you want to change the deadline, it's okay by me, but the idea of July 19 is to give me time to have your grades ready this semester. However, there are lots of things that have been postponed in the other classes. There will be exams until the end of July, so I'm not sure exactly how this will work. And if you need extra time, it's okay by me, but then of course the grades may be delayed because of that. Also, even after the classes are over, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and especially for discussing the final assignment, or even if you want to apply this to other problems that you have. Note that the final assignment should be around 20-30 hours of work, so, and about maybe 10-15 functions in size, the code size, as a rough measure. If you are working on something that is more complex than that because you need it for your work, we can just set aside one part that you're going to do for evaluation. You submit that, and then I can help you with the rest that you may need to do. So even after the classes are over, feel free to contact me if you need help with these things, and we'll keep progressing so that you can keep progressing using Python and applying this to your work. Okay, so this was the final lecture. We're going to take a short break, and at 7 o'clock I will start the Zoom meeting if anyone wants to ask questions or ask questions about this or the final assignment. Okay, so see you soon.